Hey everybody, Aaron Cowan, Sage Dynamics. In this video, we're going to talk about trigger control on the rifle. Now, by rifle, I'm talking semi-automatic, shoulder-supported firearm, whether that be an AR, an AK, a quote-unquote submachine gun, the colloquial definition of a submachine gun versus the very strict German definition of a submachine gun. That's what we're talking about. If you remember, recently I did a video on handgun trigger control. There are some slight differences, which is why the rifle has its own video. Because there's some techniques that I would use on rifle that I wouldn't necessarily apply to a handgun, or I can't apply to a handgun. First things first, there's two general categories of triggers, especially for the AR. There's single stage and two stage. Single stage is exactly kind of what it's talking about, is just one straight pull, one single weight. Whereas a two stage, there's two separate weights that you have to pull through. Two stage, and that, of course, that's a very brief definition of the differences between single and two stage triggers. Two-stage trigger is usually more preferable for precision shooting, whereas the single stage is usually more preferable for your close quarters or your CQB type environments, at least from some people. Some people want a two-stage for everything. Of course, that's a totally different topic, because right now we're just talking about the articulation of the trigger. As far as I'm concerned, single stage or two stage, the techniques remain the same. However, when it comes to precision shooting, and we'll get to that specific technique, it is a little more difficult to exercise a precision technique on a single stage versus a two stage, because a two stage just has a longer pull and it gives you a brief respite, if you will, before the final break, whereas a single stage does not. Now, if you're an AK guy or a shotgun guy, techniques can apply to you as well. And for those of you using submachine guns, some submachine guns triggers are closer to rifles, some submachine gun triggers are closer to pistols. So you kind of got to figure out, based on the operating system of the weapon that you're using, whether the rifle techniques are going to work for you or the pistol techniques are going to work for you. When it comes to accuracy issues, moving on from there, the trigger is usually not the source of the problem. The source of the problem is usually in the grip, but sometimes it's control of the trigger that causes the problem with the grip. You'll have to follow me along a little bit. Rifle systems, inherently more accurate. 3 points of contact. So we have a little bit of a luxury, and sometimes we take that luxury for granted when it comes to our ability to shoot accurately. But unlike the handgun, rifle's a little bit heavier. It's a little bit less maneuverable than a handgun, because I don't have that ability. Like with a handgun, I can pull in, I can maneuver it around a lot. With the rifle, I don't really have that option. I've got, I'm married to the cheek weld. I'm married to the shoulder support, and that presents an issue when it comes to accuracy from certain positions, such as standing, especially when we factor in the overall length of the rifle, which is why some people prefer shorter guns, myself included, because they're more maneuverable and they don't fatigue as fast. No matter how in shape you are, you have a fatigue point. It's just a matter of if your profession or the situation you're in is going to allow you to reach it. Remember from the handgun video, we talked about how sometimes one hand will allow the other hand to make a mistake, or allow the other hand to do something, and we don't consciously recognize it. You know how you can't win a tug of war with yourself unless you make that conscious decision. So if I'm shooting consistently to the right or consistently to the left, it's probably not your trigger, it's probably your actual grip itself. And that's something we have to think about on the rifle. This hand, our primary hand, our control hand, all it does is control the controls on the gun and works the trigger. This hand, our support hand, mainly supports the rifle and drives it. I'm not going to drive with this hand, I'm going to drive with this hand. I talked about this in a previous video as well, so I won't go, again, too far into it. This hand may also work controls, lasers, lights, whatever. But its primary mission in life is the steerage of the gun. This hand's primary mission in life is control of the firearm. When it comes to trigger press, you should have less of a problem with trigger press on a rifle than you should with a handgun, because this hand is steerage, this hand is simply control. This hand doesn't do a whole lot else, unless you're one of those people who are trying to steer the gun from the back of the boat. It's not something we want to do. Think about a door. The hinges, the handle. At the hinges, the door moves the most easily, right? But you can't move it at the hinges because it's more difficult. That's the bending point. That's our pivot point there on the shoulder. Here's our hinge. Do I want to control the gun closer to the hinges or closer to the handle? So if you're trying to drive the gun from the rear, that may incorporate into the trigger problems that you may be having. And again, this video is not just about accuracy issues, but that's definitely a place that some people usually look to first as the trigger, and that's usually, in my experience, not the place where the student is actually having the problem. So now we're going to get right into the techniques, the two trigger techniques. One has a variation, and I'll get to that I use. If you're familiar with the handgun video, you know I talked a lot about it. Your little finger doing its little thing is unlikely to cause any accuracy issues with the firearm at reasonable distances unless you let it. So the so-called slapping the trigger. Safety clear. My initial purchase on the trigger, by definition, is a slap, no matter how generally you place it on there. Some people talk about setting the trigger. Not a topic of this video. I'll address it in a future video. So I'm going to go ahead and get my point of aim, and when I press, firing pin fall, hammer hits firing pin, bullet goes in the barrel, blah, 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 blah. Gas, everything cycles, gun cycles. The traditional way that most people have been taught is to hold that trigger to reset. And then as soon as the cycle of operation is completed and our sights settle, we let off, we get that trigger reset, and then we're able to press again. And that gets our second shot, so on and so forth. When it comes to speed, and I talked about this in the pistol video, but I'm gonna address it again here for those people who haven't seen the pistol video yet. If you're gonna go back and watch it, that's great, because I go more in depth there. You cannot beat this trigger to mechanical reset. What I mean by that is, if you're riding the trigger out, you are actually retarding its ability to reset at its maximum ability, its maximum speed, if you will. If you take your finger off of the trigger and let the trigger reset under its own spring tension, it's going to reset faster than you could ever reset it by riding it out. Does that matter? When it comes to speed, it absolutely matters. Now, again, speed isn't always our goal, and a lot of people can actually shoot faster than they're able to get accurate hits. I see people shoot steel a lot, and they're able to get the dings, but their shot group is, well, it looks like a constellation map versus as tight as it should be in relative to the distance that they're shooting from. They're super fast on the gun, but they're not shooting a cadence to their sight picture. So that's an issue. Again, different topic. So when it comes to speed, when I want to be on the gas, my technique is trigger reset anticipation. So as the gun fires, I'm going to go ahead and shoot. My finger will immediately come off the trigger and stop right where the trigger is going to reset to. Now, what are the gains in that? Well, I'll do a little bit of demonstration right now. Go ahead and put a magazine in there. Get it seated. Now, what I'm going to do first is I'm going to fire 5 rounds, trigger reset. Then I'm going to fire 5 rounds, reset anticipation. Okay, so that's our trigger reset. That is our reset anticipation. I think that you should be able to notice a remarkable difference between the two, relatively speaking. Again, trigger reset. Again, reset anticipation. Time that perfect. Man, this thing's dirty. Does the speed matter? Personal decision. What I've just demonstrated to you that is that I am able to run the gun just a little bit faster based on my finger leaving the surface of the trigger and letting the trigger come out to my finger and then pressing back in. The speed I'm gaining is only in the resetting of the trigger. I'm not getting it from anywhere else. And some of you, or I should say those of you that are more gear focused, you'll probably notice that this is not in fact a stock trigger. It is it's a Geisley. And some people may say, well, that's the reason I'm able to shoot that fast. But you did see the two differences in speed. No matter what I'm driving, differences is differences. Technique is technique. If I'm driving a Ferrari and I'm driving it like an idiot, I'm not going to be able to drive as fast as if I actually knew what I was doing, and the trigger is no different. The more you apply the technique, now granted, the Geisley does give me a slight advantage, and we're talking like you're going to need a shot timer to tell the difference between a mil-spec trigger, quote-unquote mil-spec trigger, and the Geisley. Preferably, you know, you're going to see the same results, relatively speaking, on mil-spec triggers that you will with a single-stage, super fast, high-speed, drop-in, cool guy Geisley. Using the two different techniques, is there going to be a considerable accuracy difference? Well, I'll show you right now 5 and 5, trigger reset, and 5 reset anticipation. Of course, that wasn't from a very great distance. Reason being, the technique isn't designed for great distances. If I'm shooting beyond, and it's really hard to put a bright line distance on it, I think the situation would really dictate, but let's say for the sake of argument, that technique is for 25 meters and in. For handgun distances is when I'm going to get on the speed like that, which I think is pretty relatively reasonable. Outside of that bright line distance, which I don't really want to get into because situations can be very, in fact, every situation is going to be unique to itself. Outside of that distance, I'm probably going to use trigger reset, because it gives me maximum stability on the gun, but it doesn't give me any advantage up close when I can get on the trigger, get on the gas, and run and get more bullets on my bad guy as soon as possible. Now, you remember when I said that there were two techniques and there was a variation on one of them. So we looked at trigger reset. The variation on trigger reset is a bunch of different names for it. I call it stress removed. Stress removed is basically, if you think about the human hand, all our power is generated from the outside. So as I'm gripping that gun and I'm pulling that trigger, there is a possibility, and some people, it's a very high probability, that as I'm pulling rearward with this finger, I'm rolling my thumb into the gun, squeezing down and applying pressure I don't want. Can that drive the trigger? Well, that's a topic of very, very heated debate. I've never seen a super significant distance, except at really, really long range shooting, between the traditional trigger reset method and bringing the thumb out from behind the gun and just using these 4 fingers, 3 fingers seated on the grip itself, and the 4th finger to pull the trigger as straight to the rear as possible. Good quality triggers and good quality lower receivers and good quality firearms are not going to allow for a lot of left and right movement on the trigger group itself. What we're trying to do is pull the trigger in axis with the bore as much as possible, so there's not any downward or upward pressure either. The higher quality the firearm you have, the less likely it is for you to be able to even meaningfully introduce any left or right pressure on the trigger, besides actually pulling the gun, which you wouldn't pull the trigger that hard anyway. That'd be actually yanking on the trigger, which would cause significant accuracy issues. So the thumb remove method is more of a precision rifle application. Again, there's no reason whatsoever that you can't apply that to your patrol rifle or your duty rifle based on how much stability you have to have based on the shot that you have to take. That was a somewhat quick look at trigger control on the rifle. Again, video, there's only so much I can do, so much interaction that can take place. I believe that trigger control continues to be a very individual issue based on everybody's got different size hands, different length of pull, especially when it comes to the rifle. We've got a lot of other issues that we have to deal with. But just to give you a basic idea of my philosophy and how I'm going to teach trigger control on the rifle, I don't believe that there is such a thing as slapping the trigger so long as it's done correctly. And I don't believe that trigger reset is the end-all be-all. In fact, it can be a hindrance to speed, as you've seen. And again, I'm not the fastest shooter in the world. There's a lot of people out there that shoot way faster than I do. And if you look at their technique, they're doing something very similar or the exact same thing that I'm doing, because they understand that in order for the trigger to reset mechanically at its highest mechanical speed, they've got to get their finger off that trigger pad or that trigger shoe and let the trigger come to the finger versus riding it out. Based on your ability to shoot cadence. Now, cadence is I press the trigger every time my sights fall where I want them to be. Now, when we're shooting at static targets, pretty easy. We're shooting at movers or, God forbid, dealing with a real-life threat. You may not be able to get on the gas as much as you want because now your target gets a vote on where you're actually able to get your hits because it is a moving sight picture, or it's causing you to move your sight picture. So you also have to factor that into things as well. All things being equal, and they usually aren't, but the closer you are to your target, the more likely you are to be able to hit it as many times as possible in a very short period of time, which is beneficial because the less time we have between me and my threat, the less time I have to react and the less time I have to put that threat down. So we want to get all the bullets there as close to the same time as possible if they allow us to. If they don't, it may be 1s and 2s, or you may be able to get, 6, 7, 8, 10, 15 rounds. Why would we shoot that many times? Not really topic of the video, but since it's probably going to be a question that comes up even if someone doesn't actually type it, because there's only 2 types of incapacitation, surrender and unconsciousness. If they haven't surrendered and they're not unconscious, then they're still a threat. And if I'm still able to get a sight picture on them, I'm still going to be shooting. I'm Aaron Cowan with Sage Dynamics. Train accordingly.